Well, it was rather inevitable that I would be a lawyer because my mother was a very famous advocate and later first woman judge in England, although my father was a doctor, and ideally I would have loved to have been a doctor, but I wasn't very good with blood and gore, I'm afraid. So of the two, I chose the law. She spoilt me, but she was firm, so I knew right from wrong. And she gave me a broader view, I suppose, of society than I would have had she not been working. I always remember when I went up to university, she gave me this advice: don't take drugs, don't get pregnant, and watch the traffic. And the last one came from the fact that in her practice, she dealt a lot with people who'd been very severely injured in accident cases. That's just one example. So I went to things also that I probably wouldn't have gone to had I not been the daughter of my mother. And so it opened doors in that sense. When I was about 17, my mother, one Saturday morning, sat me down for a little chat because my father's surname was always being mispronounced. And she knew Shirley Summerskill, or at least she knew Edith Summerskill, who was a peeress, and her daughter had taken her name. And my mother had obviously discussed it with my father, and they had both thought that when I left school, it would be an advantage for me to have her name, on the basis that if a son can take the advantage of a father's name, or daughter for that matter, why can't a daughter take advantage of a mother's name? So I changed my name by deed poll. I kept my father's name as a middle name, and I obviously wouldn't have done it if he was against it, but he was very much in favour of it. Whether with hindsight it was a good idea, who knows? It made, obviously, me more recognisable in the legal world, but I suspect people would have worked that out anyway. But in those days, getting pupilage was not as it is now, where there's huge competition. My mother happened to know Gordon Slynn, and he'd already taken as a pupil somebody from my college at Oxford the year ahead of me, and I met him for the first day on my first day of pupilage. Now, the next stage, which is even perhaps more interesting, is in those days, chambers were trying to take on women, and they were taking on, they each felt they ought to copy each other, so they were all taking on one, what they called statutory woman. There was no statute, because the Equal Pay Act and the Equal Opportunities Act hadn't come into existence in those days. So you were basically limited to one set of chambers, and you had to find one which didn't have a woman. And I became the first woman in chambers and remained so for 10 years. I was the only woman tenant for 10 years. In the commercial world, there were very few of us. And we used to have these dinners every so often. It wasn't sort of a big feminist thing. It was just a few women getting together. And including the solicitors, there'd probably be only about 20 of us. So there were very few of us doing this sort of work in those days. I mean, it's all changed now, which is obviously great. So my career has been doing commercial litigation and giving commercial advice. More recently, in the last few years, I've done much more in international arbitration, which has grown exponentially in the last 20 years. And so now I do probably the preponderance, though not exclusively, international arbitration. I sit a lot as an arbitrator, and I also act as counsel or do court-related work which concerns arbitration. Well, this photograph was taken the day I took silk, and it's a photograph of me in my full silk regalia and my mother with her judicial wig on, not the formal full red robes, but her everyday judicial attire. And it is, I suppose, historic to have a female judge with her daughter as a female Queen's Counsel. and follows on from the fact that earlier in that day, in the Chief Justice's Court, my mother actually called me into the inner bar as a Queen's Counsel. I'm sure she was proud, as any mother would be. She didn't go round saying that to me. I'm sure that would make me big-headed, but she was undoubtedly pleased to see the legal tradition carrying on. I didn't feel under my mother's shadow because I didn't do what she did. She practiced criminal law, common law, family law on the Northern Circuit. I wanted to move to London. I don't think it was necessarily for career reasons. I simply love London. And so I moved to a different circuit, a different town, and I did a different sort of work. So they couldn't make direct comparison. So I was always very proud of what she did, but I never felt it inhibited me in any way.